we could have met face to face, but it is really nice to see everybody again. So this is, I'm from LCT Stellenbosch. I'm quickly going to share my screen with you. Okay, I hope you can see it now.
Yeah, it's showing Marnel.
Okay, thank you so much. So warm greetings from Stellenbosch. We are in South Africa, if you don't know, in the south, close to Cape Town. This is a town where mostly it's a university town, but also very well known for its beautiful, wonderful wines. So hope to see you here one day. So this is our group, our LCT group in Stellenbosch. Most of us are from the faculties of engineering and science, although we have some other members, such as JP there on the other side. These are the photos that comes from LCT2 and LCT3, and I hope that we can add to this in future. So today with me is also Ilse Rootman-Le Grange, as well as Christine Steenkamp. So the three of us will be presenting this session, whereas some of our other colleagues will be in the sessions here after 27 and 28. Okay, so this session is about science education. So in acting LCT in science education, we face quite a few challenges there, and this is about how LCT helps us to face and how to handle some of these challenges. So we will be sharing with you today 3 examples from what we've done in science. Ilse will be first. She will be looking at curriculum design. Then Christine will follow with looking at how she handled problems in assessment. And then I will be speaking about scientific language. And like I said, some of our other colleagues will be speaking in session 28. Ingrid Ravitsky and Max Blackie, as well as Hanli Adendorf, and then others will be in session 41, where it will be the launch of our new science education book. We are very excited about that. Okay, so I think after the 2 years we've just been through, I don't need to tell you about the importance or the relevance of science, and obviously about science education. That is pretty obvious. But I think when we talk about the purpose of science, obviously it's to produce a new generation of scientists. And that is what most academic scientists believe. But also, and also importantly, it is to offer young people in general education in and about science for the purpose of developing an understanding about the vast explanatory power that science has to offer to a world that is faced with many and complex challenges, as you know. So some of these challenges obviously include existential threats such as global warming and diseases like COVID-19, as we've just been through. And it is therefore apparent that science education should be to educate students both about the major explanations of the material world that science offers, but also about the way that science works. It is also interesting to note that that reasoning and understanding science is becoming desired attributes for many citizens in the future countries of the world. However, wide-ranging studies about science education have pointed out that it requires serious investments in a few things. Among others, skilled science educators on all levels of education, but these science educators must be willing to continuously develop their own knowledge as well as their own teaching practice. Then we also need truly engaging science curricula, as well as well-structured assessment protocols and structures that would actually meet the desired outcomes and goals. And sadly, currently, we are not achieving this goal. So they've shown, for instance, that in many European countries, there's a decline in the number of students that enroll for degrees in science. So science education continues to be or seem to be a substantial hurdle for both lecturers and students around the world. Students seem to find science courses difficult to master, and lecturers sometimes find it challenging to teach. That obviously differs from discipline to discipline. Now, in higher education, we have another problem. Some academic scientists are simply not interested in developing their own pedagogy or learning about teaching and learning, and they feel that conducting their disciplinary research is more than enough. While others are actually willing to do so, but they often struggle to engage with the scholarship of teaching and learning. And conducting science education research obviously is an even bigger challenge. So the stumbling block for these seem to be the apparent lack of clarity in the links between the method and theoretical framework, which is very different to the so-called scientific method that we use in science. And this is where LCT comes in, or actually comes to the rescue. So we have found that LCT seems to provide a welcome entry point into a scholarly approach to science pedagogy and also even to rigorous science education research. Academic scientists often experience LCT as more science-like and therefore less foreign. And this is now obviously relative to other education research frameworks. And as you all know, LCT offers a whole suite of tools which we can use for a wide range of purposes and problems. Okay, so here with then our 3 examples from our Faculty of Science and our group in science. So first up would be Ilse, and she will introduce her talk to you. Thank you so much.
I'd like to start this input with a quote by Keith Tarber, who is a chemistry education specialist. He says, "Chemistry graduates should have been supported by their undergraduate studies in developing critical thinking as much as history graduates, in developing teamwork skills as much as business graduates, and in developing their creativity as much as engineering graduates. Otherwise, we disadvantage our chemistry graduates and the organizations that will employ them." This quote articulates a particular, not necessarily unique, challenge we as science educators are faced with more and more. 21st century scientists need to solve problems that spans various disciplines, problems that require comprehensive solutions. And this calls on science educators to design curricula that integrates knowledge and practices from different disciplines. I'm coordinator of a first-year academic literacies module for BC students from all different programs offered in our faculty. The purpose of this module is to teach students some of the transferable skills that they need in addition to disciplinary knowledge to become fully fledged 21st century scientists. Unfortunately, though I guess not surprisingly, over the years, this module has always been somewhat controversial, for the lack of a better word. Although the scientists in the faculty also always agreed that students need to be taught the specific content and skills, they weren't convinced that the students were learning much. And amongst the students, the module had a very poor reputation, as they really struggled to see how its content was relevant to their particular program of study. So what did we do? We used autonomy as a lens to look at the typical approaches used in STEM education to bring together knowledge from diverse backgrounds. Then we used this insight to rationalize the curriculum redesign of our transferable skills module. Why did we do this? Autonomy provided us with a tool to gain insight into the successes and pitfalls of different approaches that have been used in the past to teach transferable skills in STEM environments specifically. It also gave us a tool with which we could rationalize the redesign of what we were doing. Autonomy comes from the premise that any set of practices or ideas consists of a set of constituents that are arranged in a particular way. In essence, autonomy helps us to investigate the question of where things come from, positional autonomy, and for what purpose they are used, relational autonomy. This makes it an ideal tool to study the integration of knowledge and skills from diverse backgrounds. When we plot the two relations on a Cartesian plane as depicted here, we can identify 4 quadrants, which we refer to as the sovereign, projected, exotic, and introjected. In the sovereign code, we'll typically see science curricula where scientists, as well as the objects and ideas and theories of science, is being used specifically to advance science and learning how to think like a scientist. In contrast, in the exotic code, we might see science curricula using objects, ideas, and theories from fields other than science for the purpose other than advancing science. For example, using content from social sciences to teach students about group work. An example of the introjected code might be science curricula using objects, theories, and methods of science to dissuade students from religious beliefs. While an example of the projected code might be science curricula that uses indigenous knowledge systems as examples to teach specific scientific concepts. We developed a translation device for our context and plotted the various aspects of our curriculum on the autonomy plane. We then redesigned the assessment product and reorganized the content in order to purposefully create autonomy tours that could potentially enable integrative knowledge building. This redesign process was a huge collaborative effort between language specialists, disciplinary specialists, and computer literacy lecturers who are all involved in teaching this module. We used the module's outcomes and purpose to guide us in defining a translation device. In short, this entails that we show to students how science operates across disciplinary boundaries to find comprehensive solutions for 21st century challenges, and that this requires scientists to have skills that are typically seen as coming from outside the science context. We then defined the 4 quadrants for our translation device as follows. So in the sovereign code, we say using science content to learn the ways and methods and content of science, so how to become a scientist. In the exotic code, we have using content from outside of science for the purpose of something other than what it means to be a scientist. In the projected code, with the green block, we have using science content for the purpose of something else. While in this blue block, we have the introjected code, using content from outside of science to learn the ways and methods and content of science, so how to become a scientist. In the past, this module followed what Shada calls a bolting on approach, where transferable skills was taught explicitly in 2 separate, purposefully designed modules, offered by language specialists and computer literacy specialists, respectively. When analyzing this approach through the lens of autonomy, we came to see why students struggled to see the purpose of what they're doing, and why lecturers had the feeling that students were not really learning anything. Let's look at an example. When a literacy specialist teaches referencing skills for the purpose of knowing how to reference correctly, that specialist operates in a sovereign code. But the students who are operating in a science discipline are likely to experience this as an exotic code activity, not seeing the relevance to their science studies. This code clash then fails to produce an environment for learning to take place. In reality, what often happens, though, is that the literacy specialists recognize that they come from a different context than the students, and in the attempt to contextualize the learning activity within the student's context. The literacy specialist thus operates in a projected code, where they use their subject knowledge and apply it to a science context. By doing this, they may help students to see the purpose of developing these skills for their context, thus helping them to see the workshop as being situated in the introjected code. In addition, Jacobs argues that this move from the sovereign code to the projected code is very difficult for literacy specialists to make when they are working in isolation, as is generally the case in a bolting-on approach. The reason being that literacy specialists are not familiar with the science discourse. She thus suggests for this approach to succeed, it also requires collaboration between the literacy specialist who has the ability to make the skills explicit and the disciplinary specialist who knows the science context. This collaboration enables the literacy specialist to make the move from the sovereign code to the projected code much easier and more convincingly, while the disciplinary specialist operates in an introjected code, which should then enable the students to experience this as an introjected code activity, not exotic code activity. In the case of our transferable skills module, collaboration amongst the disciplinary specialists and the literacy specialists was completely absent. And when we started to engage with each other, it became clear that the language specialists attempted to operate in the projected code, but that they struggled to make sense of the science context, and that the students picked up on this, not making the move from the exotic code to the introjected code. So the autonomy dimension really helped us to see one of the possible reasons why this module was struggling to achieve its purpose, and it helped us to identify a way to address this disconnect. Based on the insight we gained, our focus in redesigning the module could thus be formulated as follows: to approach the design process collaboratively and to recontextualize the content in such a way that we emphasize the interdisciplinary nature of 21st century science. So let's look at the outcome. On the macro level, the module was structured around an interdisciplinary group project, which, due to the nature of the project, is situated in the projected code. To produce this project, students then require both science-specific knowledge and transferable skills, which we offer in a co-teaching format. On the meso level, we purposefully structured the content to produce autonomy tours that spans across all 4 quadrants of the autonomy plane. Let's quickly track the autonomy pathway of this module. We start off in the exotic code where students don't know why they're doing this module, what this is all about. And we move them into the projected code by explaining the project and its purpose. Then they choose their topics and they start to plan on their group work. They have various writing and computer skills activities they need to participate in. They do a literature study on the content of the project. They get mentoring from a scientist. They compile a document. They submit a draft version of this document and they get feedback from both scientists as well as literacy specialists. And then they do a presentation of their final project as the final output of the module. So we hope and we believe, based on the theory, that by introducing these autonomy tours, we modulate to students how the knowledge from diverse sources come together in this module, thereby supporting integrative knowledge building. And to see how the students experience this and what the impact of this redesigned module has been over the last few years, I am going to share with you some feedback from the students as well as scientists who have been involved in mentoring the students. And I'll leave you by your own to read this. Well, thank you for listening to that presentation along with me of where I've been using LCT autonomy in my practice in developing a curriculum in the science context. Are there any questions from the audience at this time regarding this input? I just need to get my chat showing. I'm not that familiar with Zoom. I usually work in Teams and I'm slightly lost. Marnel, if you can see the chat or any hands raised, will you please?
Yes, I can.
Guide them. Thank you.
There's a question asking great description, but wonder why the outcome appears to end in the projected code.
I'm not exactly sure if I understand the question correctly. Sarah, I see your camera going on. Is that from you? Okay. Can you unmute and maybe just clarify a bit?
Hi, thank you. Can you see that I'm in my pajamas?
No, I can't. That's fine.
Okay, good. No, I'd love that. I was trying to follow the description. I really wanted to have that slowed down to see how the course mapped on the autonomy codes. And it looked like the final task or the final event was it finished off in the top left-hand quadrant. And I thought, if that's projected code, I would have imagined, just because I'm a primary teacher, I would have imagined that to finish off in the elite code.
The sovereign, yeah.
So, yeah, well, the sovereign code.
I think that's kind of what we expect, but it's not a prerequisite. That's kind of the way we think, maybe, that we always need to end there. But taking into consideration this is about integrating knowledge from different disciplines, I think actually ending there reiterates that, kind of brings that message across again, that we're using science, but science skills and other skills. It's so the basis of the module is that transferable skills project, which is then also in its essence kind of situated in that code.
And it's still an insider kind of code too, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Janet, did you unmute? Would you like to ask anything, comment something?
Hi, this is Debbie Blaine from
Hi, Debbie.
I've also got a question.
Yes.
So I was actually, this question comes from being on the advisory board of a honors program for material science. And one of the modules that they have is professional communication, which kind of aligns with this module as well.
Yeah.
And there was a very interesting discussion where some of the lecturers were like, in professional communication, the students should be learning how to write a project report or a technical report that with technical discourse. And the literacy experts were basically trying to teach them how to write scientific communication for a wider audience.
Yeah.
So obviously, depending on what your outcome is, what you want to try and teach, what kind of literacy you want to try and teach, there's going to be the goal is very different. So I'm wondering, it's kind of connected to the previous question of, is this a projected code or a sovereign code? What is the purpose? Are you teaching them how to write and how to understand literature in order to understand science, or in order to communicate to a wider audience? So something that I've also been thinking about with this conference is, which quadrant you end up in or which path you follow on the tour can be very personal, depending on your own journey.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, is there a paper that goes with this that kind of walks you through I also thought it was very interesting, like, okay, why are you there and why are you there? The tour that you're taking, how have you as researchers mapped that out? And being cognizant of the fact that may not be the only way to map it out, but it's still interesting to get in somebody else's head. I don't really know if I have a question, but maybe just some comment.
Well, valuable comments, thank you. And I totally agree that I think when we map this, we all might have slightly different views of how this actually maps, but the main message here is that there is a tour happening. We really made effort to make sure that we are moving through all of the quadrants in order to support this integrated knowledge building. And what I realized also when we looked at the original curriculum is when I look at it, I look at it from a scientist's perspective. When the language specialist looks at it, who works with me on the module, she has a completely different perspective of this. When the computer literacy specialists look at it, they have a different picture. And then you have to think, so what's the picture of the student? So yes, it is true. We have a different idea or maybe starting point or picture of this, but we're moving around, and I think that's the essence. Unfortunately, Debbie, this isn't yet in a paper, but I am on campus. We can talk a bit as well over this at a later stage. Marnel, yes, I guess I need to move on to Christine's presentation. Is that what you wanted to say?
Yes, there are some more interesting comments, but I think we need to move on. So
I am going to move on to Christine. Do you want to say something before I start off?
No, I'm fine. I just also wanted to say there are things in the chat, but you will have to react to that later.
Oh, well,
you are welcome to play my my presentation. Thanks.
All right.
The semantics dimension of legitimation code theory for improvement of introductory physics. Physics as a discipline is based on a highly abstract hierarchical knowledge structure consisting of interrelated core concepts. Each of these core concepts is applicable to a vast range of contexts, and also a variety of representations for knowledge are used, such as verbal, mathematical, and graphic representations. The context here is the first-year students in our mainstream calculus-based physics modules. Our priority is these students' learning and their preparation for subsequent study. We also want to develop their scientific problem-solving skills. Therefore, the challenge is to cultivate cumulative learning, enabling the students to transfer knowledge across contexts to new problems, and also to build knowledge over time in subsequent study years. This study focused on assessment. Firstly, because assessment is a key high-stakes aspect of learning that influences students' approach to learning. Secondly, because the setting of summative assessments is a regulated process in our environment, involving the lecturers and the moderator. A framework for judgment is therefore absolutely essential. The semantics dimension of legitimation code theory offers such a framework, distinguishing between context dependence, termed semantic gravity, and the condensation of meaning, termed semantic density. Semantic gravity and semantic density are independent of one another and are both relevant in the context of assessment. We have been using the semantics dimension in teaching practice since 2017, when we started setting question papers guided by the semantic gravity strength of different questions. I've been using that in the modules where I'm involved up to date. But it has also enabled me to ask research questions. For example, what was the impact of these changes implemented in the assessment in 2017? And by answering them, looking at data from 2016 and 2017. More recently, I have been asking myself what happened in the online exams when we had to change to a remote teaching. And for that, I will be discussing data from 2021, comparing that to 2017. Our method was to analyze the semantic gravity and semantic density strengths of the assessment questions and also the expected model answers, and to investigate the impact of these on the average marks as a measure of student learning. The semantic gravity analysis explored the impact of context dependence. In the case of semantic gravity, question and answer pairs were coded as units. The semantic density analysis explored the impact of the condensation of meaning in terms, symbols, and other representations. In the case of semantic density, the questions and answers often had quite different semantic densities, and therefore questions and answers were coded separately. The translation devices that we used are represented here in a slightly simplified version. Looking at the semantic gravity translation device, starting at the weakest semantic gravity strength, semantic gravity double minus, that requires the formulation of a core concept without reference to any example or any scenario. Semantic gravity minus is the application of a core concept to a simplified empirical scenario that is in the curriculum closely associated with the specific core concept. Semantic gravity plus involves the application of a core concept to a well-defined scenario, but a scenario that will feel a bit unfamiliar to the student because it is in the curriculum not closely associated with the concept. Semantic gravity double plus is the application of core concepts to a real-world problem, where the student is additionally required to apply some everyday knowledge or to make assumptions. Regarding the semantic density translation device, we are listing here the 5 most common representations of knowledge used in introductory physics, organized according to their semantic density. So from the weaker end of the scale, semantic density double minus is a verbal representation of the problem in everyday words. It can include a photo or a sketch, but without conveying any technical terms or technical details. Semantic density minus is a verbal representation of the problem using key technical terms and symbols, and it can include a diagram conveying technical details. Semantic density 0, the middle category, is a graph or a vector diagram conveying relationships between quantities in the problem. Semantic density plus is a mathematical representation of relations between key concepts, and semantic density double plus is a mathematical representation that has been condensed to construct a mathematical model for the problem. I would have loved to discuss examples of all of these categories, but with time lacking, you will have to chat to me afterwards. We studied the impact of this newly introduced semantic gravity guided assessments using both semantic gravity and semantic density analysis. The semantic gravity strength of a question answer pair correlated strongly with the average marks. And this relation was, interestingly enough, influenced strongly by the focus of the teaching. I will illustrate it here with 2 graphs showing average marks versus the semantic gravity strength for 2016 and 2017. Up to 2016, questions directly on core concepts were underrepresented in our assessments. Obviously, the lecturers knew the value of knowing core concepts, but our assessments didn't convey that knowledge to the students. And therefore, when core concepts were asked, they were poorly answered. On the other hand, when students were asked to transfer their knowledge of core concepts to real-world examples, this transfer was also limited. Since 2017, the analysis of our assessments helped us to focus on core concepts, not only in assessment but also in teaching. And this led to a significant improvement in the students' ability to formulate core concepts and, interestingly enough, to apply their knowledge of core concepts in real-world scenarios. Therefore, we concluded, first of all, that analyzing our assessments using semantic gravity increased the focus on core concepts. And we also made a preliminary conclusion that knowing the core concepts and being able to formulate them correctly helps students to transfer their knowledge to real-world context. This last conclusion had to be confirmed by looking at the semantic density. So we have seen that the semantic density strength of the answer, not the question, had correlation with the marks. What we also saw is that the correlation was not influenced by the change in focus in 2017. The correlation was fairly similar for 2016 and 2017. That means that the semantic density analysis supported these conclusions. What happened when we were forced to change to remote teaching and assessment in 2021? My analysis shows that, firstly, the online open book exams limited the range of semantic gravity strengths that we assessed. The lowest semantic gravity strength as well as the highest semantic gravity strength had to be reduced in weight as we couldn't really assess these properly. Secondly, the semantic gravity and semantic density strength analysis showed up new problem areas. For example, students struggled more to construct graphs. Students struggled more where they had to and analyze an unfamiliar scenario. And students also struggled more where they had to derive a condensed mathematical representation, in other words, of a mathematical model. Unfortunately, this brings us to the conclusion that our students seem to be less well skilled in problem solving after 2 years of remote teaching. There will be a range of reasons for this problem. I conclude. First of all, the semantics dimension of LCT empowered me and my colleagues by giving us a framework for discussing assessments. I have demonstrated here the long-term use of semantic gravity as a guide in assessment design. And I have also demonstrated the use of semantic gravity and density in order to understand the impact of change in our educational practice in introductory physics. Thank you to my colleagues who contributed and for this opportunity.
And thank you very much for listening. Do we still have time for questions now, Marnel?
Yes, we will have about 2 or 3 minutes for questions. Okay. See, there's one. Sarah asked why you had no semantic gravity 0 on your graphs.
Yes, I did not, simply because it fitted our data to have 4 categories on the semantic gravity scale and 5 on the semantic density scale. It is actually not a problem to have a different number of categories on the 2 set of axes. Any other questions? I could maybe add that my biggest problem was this tension between, so I wanted to capture also what students experience from an assessment question. And the tension in physics is that the real life experience of students and the theory that they learn in the textbook are very widely removed from one another. So students actually experience, and one can see it there, they experience low semantic gravity, in other words, abstract concepts, as easier to answer normally if they have studied it, than applying their knowledge to scenario, because and especially applying it sometimes to real life examples. Yeah, Ilse also has been involved in that, but I really struggled in putting these to the real life experience versus what is in the curriculum together. So the semantic gravity translation device was my solution for that, where I do mention the curriculum also, and I do ask myself whether a concept has been associated with the specific real life or then just the empirical scenario in the curriculum. But I do stick to the idea that stronger semantic gravity means that it's more associated with real life and embedded in a context in real life.
Thank you so much, Christine, for your insights. And I think it emphasizes again how we grapple with these. I see Debbie has another comment. I think that we are possibly grossly underestimating the tacit learning that happens in live classes, where we model the way we want students to interpret and answer questions. Yes,
I cannot agree more. That is true.
Yes. Thank you, Christine. Ilse will share mine. Thank you. Thanks, Christine.
Yeah, Marnel is the next speaker, and she will talk in scientific language.
Good day, everyone. I'm going to talk about the challenge that our students face of learning and writing science. Science, like all other academic discourse, uses power words and grammar to basically package the knowledge of the field. This is a specialized, concise language using passive voice, usually to formulate clear, objective arguments, usually to report new findings or to elucidate experimental results. But this specialized language, with its complex meaning, can be quite foreign to novices in the field, like our students, and they often find it very difficult to engage with. In science programs, we expect students to engage with complex disciplinary texts, such as textbooks and journal articles, and then to demonstrate their mastery of the subject matter using appropriate scientific discourse. And many studies have highlighted that students find this extremely challenging. This image here basically summarizes the problem or the challenge and why this work was done. You can see here on the y-axis we have simpler meaning towards the bottom and complex meaning towards the top. So the texts that our students need to deal with, what they need to read, that they need to make sense of in their textbooks and journal articles, is quite complex in meaning. We also expect them to do writing, scientific writing, using proper scientific language that is also complex in meaning. Mouton calls this high-stakes reading, and he calls this high-stakes writing, and this is what we find that especially our first-year students struggle with. So what was done? Firstly, we explored ways to help the students actually develop this new language and come to terms with this type of literacy by developing their discourse skills. And for this, we used collaborative pedagogy and project-based learning. So the students had a few opportunities to actually use their textbooks and journal articles and then to produce scientific writing. But we also analyzed their discourse. Firstly, we analyzed the final summative assessment of the year. We picked sections from that summative assessment, and we also, as a comparison, selected the corresponding parts of the school and the first year textbook as a baseline. So as a conceptual framework, we used LCT semantics, and I don't think I need to tell you what semantics is about. As you know, we use semantic gravity and semantic density. These are the two concepts of semantics. Semantic gravity is the degree to which meaning relates to its context, whereas semantic density is the degree of condensation of meaning. Now for this study, we only used semantic density. However, this term complexity is rather relative, and it can refer to the mental aspects of learning by focusing on the cognitive demand of the assignment. And Mouton and Doran therefore proposed a translation device for the analysis of epistemic semantic density in discourse. Thus, semantic density that considers the epistemological condensation of formal definitions and empirical descriptions. Epistemic semantic density, or ESD, conceptualizes complexity in terms of the condensation of meaning within practices, and it furthermore explores the relationality of meanings. We used this translation device. In our case, we looked at the scientific discourse of the students as well as the two textbooks. Firstly, all discourse can be divided into two word group types, the technical words as well as everyday words. Technical words can again be divided into two further groups, as well as everyday words. And from there on, every one of these categories can be divided again into further subtypes. This is known as the wording tool as proposed by Mouton and Doran, and this is known as the word grouping tool. So you would use the translation device to code all the words, but there's also the word grouping, which strengthens a word epistemic semantic density by adding even more meaning. So this gave us a very fine-grained device to do the analysis. As you can see, we color-coded each one of these categories so that it would be easier to do the analysis. Okay, so what did the analysis tell us about the challenge that the student is facing with scientific language? Our first finding revealed that the scientific language which is used in the school and the first year textbooks differed significantly in terms of complexity as well as volume. As you can see here, we have epistemic semantic density, and as you can see here, in the first year textbook we have two top categories here, which is the words with the most complex meaning that we identified in this text. And these two categories are completely absent from the school textbook. Also, the top green bar here represents the word grouping tool, and there was also quite a bit of that found in the first year textbook as opposed to the school textbook. So this is an enormous jump for these students coming from school to university, and this will explain why they really struggle to use their first year textbook. As I explained earlier, epistemic semantic density also considers the relationality of the meanings. So for this purpose, we here constructed a concept map for a specific concept. So this shows all the different terms or concepts and how they relate to the original one. So this is the description from the first year textbook, and as you can see, it has quite a few concepts relating to that meaning. If we compare that to the school textbook, you will see that it only used 4 of these other concepts, and also the descriptions were not fully showing the relationality of these meanings towards one another. Our second finding was that the scientific vocabulary of the students varied considerably. Now you have to keep in mind that this was after a few events or opportunities where they could develop their scientific language. So if we look at that analysis from the discourse, you will see that students 4, 5, and 6 did really well. They had words that they could use properly to actually explain certain concepts and unpack the meaning, whereas these 3 students really struggled to do so. We also find interesting patterns in terms of the unpacking of these complex concepts by some of the students. This is students for description of the concept of the nucleus. Now this student had adequate vocabulary to use, but she also used them in a very skillful way. It was as if she described this specific concept from various angles, and with this description she basically did the shifting between complex meaning and simpler meaning. So her description made this beautiful semantic wave. So she was able to unpack and repack this complex meaning in her own words. So the ideal would be to show students that this is the way that it should be done, the unpacking of this complex meaning in their own words, and then the repacking of the complex meaning, producing these beautiful semantic waves in their discourse. Now, still on the topic of unpacking of complex meaning, we found that the first year textbook does very little to no unpacking of complex scientific concepts, and that would also explain why they struggle to use it. So we compared the description of some of these concepts from the first year textbook here in pink to that of that star students, if I can call it that. So remember the previous student that I showed you, the beautiful way that she was able to unpack that complex meaning in her own words and repack it. When we compare that to the first year textbook, you can see that the first year textbook is very concise. There is very little unpacking. This would also show the role of the lecturer to help them to actually do this unpacking themselves and the repacking, producing these beautiful semantic waves. So to conclude, LCT Semantics obviously made it possible for us to reveal the nature of this challenge that is faced by especially our first year students in science regarding scientific language. So we were able to show the scale of the scientific language gap between the school and the first year textbook. It is really enormous. There's also a huge difference in the density of the discourse in these textbooks, and the first year textbook was found to be extremely compact in terms of meaning. And we also discovered the importance of unpacking these complex scientific concepts and to help students to actually do this themselves, to unpack that complex meaning and then to repack it so that they can actually make sense of that high stakes reading. And this is obviously done by producing semantic waves in their discourse. So this is very important in the learning but also the writing process. So there's a need for a science pedagogy that would allow for students to firstly develop these fundamental skills and basically learn the rules of the game for unpacking and repacking the complex meaning, to actually become skillful in scientific learning and also writing, because I think this is imperative to help them cross this gap between high-stakes reading and high-stakes writing in the science disciplines. Thank you so much. Good day, everyone. I'm going to...
Okay, it seems I'm talking again. Thank you, everyone. Are there any questions? I've answered a few in the chat that I could see. Are there any other questions? I'm just going to talk about the last one. Could what your first language is have an impact on the results? And absolutely yes. So in the South African context, we find that many students obviously are not studying writing in their first or their home language. So for many of them, it's a second or sometimes even third language, and it definitely plays a role. However, if you look at this data, nearly, I think, apart from one student, all the others were writing in their second language. So some seems to be more ready for this than others. And therefore, we need to create these opportunities for them to actually come to terms with or literally practicing how to do this. But there's firstly the problem of making sense of what they read. So that is the first problem, and then the writing. So this is it's kind of a double whammy, and I've heard many other speakers talk about the same thing, especially in South Africa. So yes, it absolutely plays a role.
Marnel, could I ask, do you have any suggestion of, you talk about a pedagogy, but sorry, that would allow for development of these skills. Do you have a suggestion? Should that be something that it would just have to be practiced inside the discipline, or should it be separate? Do you have any comment on that?
What we've done, those opportunities that we've created, we have, Ilse spoke about academic literacy. So what we've done, they've shown that those are actually more effective when they're actually part of a discipline or inside, a discipline. So what we've done, before COVID now disrupted everything, with our colleagues at Academic Literacies, we had a project. So they would do a project in university practice. That would be a collaboration between science as well as the academic literacies, very similar to what Ilse showed, but we also had others more applicable to biology, specifically now here what I teach, and then also in collaboration with those academic literacy lecturers. So they would mark the language part of it, whereas I would mark the science part of it. So we had those collaborations, and that's what I'm talking about. Sometimes we, it's a lot of work to mark these assignments that we give the students, but it is very important to actually give those assignments to them so that they can develop these skills, because I think sometimes it's easier to give them assessments that does not require so much marking, but I think in the long run it might be to their detriment.
There are now a few questions in the chat. Marnel, I can read it. JP Bosman asked, how can one address the problem, rewrite the school textbook or rewrite the first year textbook or annotate the annotation on the textbook? That's essentially a question.
That's a good question, JP. I must say for a long time, I observed this and I couldn't really understand it, because to me, the first year textbook is beautiful. It has lots of illustrations, and to me, it felt like it was really explaining and unpacking things. But eventually I just went and I got myself a whole set of the school textbooks, and then I could see where the problem came in. So yeah, that is a very good question. In my opinion, the school textbook should be a little bit more complex, because I can't see the first year textbook actually becoming less condensed, because we already have so much that we're trying to teach them, and it's actually, to somebody that is not a novice, it is not really complex, but to them their jump is. So I don't really know what the answer to that is, but I think what is important is that lecturers are very aware of that big jump, because then it makes sense, and then you can actually scaffold your teaching in a way that you produce semantic waves that would obviously then help them to cross this gap, because the gap is there. We just need to actually find a way to get across it. So I think that is the most important part, but we need to create opportunities for them to actually, that they have to read that. Okay, I don't know what the time is now, Christine.
I have to move on. Janet West asked about publications. Yes, Janet, a lot of this has been published, and in the new book and in old books and in papers. Yeah, we can answer that in the chat. And Debbie says, okay, there's a comment of perhaps a bridging literacy course before university starts. That would be great. Anyway, statistics from the South African Department of Education show that the comprehension skills in South Africa is very low. Yeah, so here's a lot of discussion. I think, Marnel, you will have to read and answer here in the chat. Not a reaction to your talk. Yeah.
I can just maybe mention that both Christine's work and my work, and Ilse is part of both of that. That is a new science education book that will be launched tomorrow. So we're very excited about that. So this specific work you can find there, but I think it's also been, Christine's has been in other publications as well that you will be able to find, I guess, online.
Yeah, if you Google my name.
Okay, so I think that is, so I think what we showed here is some of the problems that we grapple with in science education. Just, I mean, this is just a few. Our other colleagues will in session, I think 28, they will speak about problems in about the knower as well as mathematics. So you can see those other presentations there. But we have grappled with these problems, and LCT was so helpful. So here you've seen how we've used autonomy, as well as Christine used semantic gravity and semantic density. I've used those before really successfully, and this time we used the wording tool and the word grouping tool. So LCT really helped us to make sense of these observations that we see sometimes, but there's not really another way to actually come to any understanding about it. So are there any other, is there anything else that you would like to add, Christine or Ilse?
I can just agree with you. That is really true.
So we will end off with Ilse playing a short clip showing just some of these publications that maybe you asked about. And then we will hand over to 4 o'clock, we will hand over to our colleagues from engineering, and after that will be a combined session. So this is all from the Stellenbosch clip. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to engage with you in the next session with our engineering colleagues, and then 28, where we all come together.